Joining me today is Kate Vidgen, Executive Director, Resources and Infrastructure at Macquarie Capital. She'll be speaking at IR's Iron Ore Project Development and Logistics Conference, which takes place on the 27th to 28th June 2011 in Perth. Kate, thanks for joining me today.
No problem, James.
First of all, what's the key to getting resources infrastructure project financed?
I think it can be summarised in 3 words: planning, planning and more planning. Essentially, our experience is that it's really important when you're looking at these projects to understand that they're not independent. They actually fit very snugly in with or very integrally into the mine financing and development. And it's really important that project developer thinks about the financing decisions up front, and when making all decisions, whether it be about procurement or offtake partners or equity partners, they have regard to the impact it might have on the funding. There are many other things that are really important, we think, to actually ensure that you have a successful project financing. But the only other thing I'd say at the moment is that there are an awful lot of projects out there, not only in WA but beyond, and it's really important to package up your story very carefully, have ticked all the boxes and make sure it's presented in a really logical way where financiers have confidence that the project can be developed on time and in accordance with the story you've outlined. So actually providing them with that confidence is a very important thing also.
What funding options actually exist and what considerations need to be taken in each instance?
But essentially there are 2 tiers of funding decision. The first is the form of the capital structure, and that's really about the mix between debt and equity, and within the debt box, senior debt, mezz and hybrids. And the second tier of decision is which markets are you going to go to. The considerations for each of these are very complex, but ultimately the decisions which are made are about every aspect of the project, including offtake terms and customers, procurement partners and structures, capex and business profile going forward. That's ultimately why this funding decision must be actually thought about up front and not back-ended as part of the process. That is, it really needs to be developed in parallel with all the other key project decisions.
What are some of the risks and other issues that you should consider when getting involved with such a project?
There's a couple of things that spring to mind in the current environment. At the moment, there's a lot of really large-scale projects around, and the big issue that arises in those projects is how you generate sufficient volume of funding. And I think there's a natural tension between the desire to maximise third-party finance and the quid pro quo you have to give from the sources of that finance. These can include giving up offtake or giving up procurement rights or giving up equity. The second major risk or issue is that we all know at the moment that the pressures on developing projects, capex, and the need to, and actually the scarcity of contractors, equipment and supply. And this is causing, I think, a number of financiers to be quite nervous about the development period. So things like completion guarantees and cost overruns are going to be front and centre in front of financiers' minds, and project sponsors really need to think about how they're going to solve those issues. Perhaps the third thing, and this is something that the outcomes only or the impacts only come about down the track, but you need to think up front, is when you're putting financing forms in place, how is it going to impact on you on the future? You want to develop your project, you want to expand it, you want to create operational efficiencies. It's really important you don't put financing in place that will hinder any of those future growth options.
And what are some of the regulatory and procurement issues that need to be considered?
Anyone who's been in WA knows how complex regulatory regimes can be, but they will be very front of mind for financiers. The reason is to fund any rail and port infrastructure, for example, with any meaningful level of debt, long-term offtakes with creditworthy partners need to be put in place. To the extent that these tariffs are negotiated outside a regulatory regime, and there's a risk that the assets may become regulated in the future, real issues can arise for financiers, particularly if their offtake contracts can be reset at a regulated tariff in the future. So again, the regulatory strategy will impact on the form of financing you're able to get and actually the amount of financing you're able to get. So you need to think about that up front. In terms of procurement, there really are multiple issues that will impact on the financing. For example, what form of procurement strategy are financiers going to be comfortable with, and how many packages should you be looking at? What is the credit profile of your key contractors, and who should be responsible for the interface between packages? Who's responsible for cost overruns? And another really interesting question is can you develop a procurement strategy that actually increases your chance of maximising funding pressure, i.e. are any of the developers or equipment suppliers likely to be able to assist you to obtain ECA finance?
Kate, you're speaking at IR's Iron Ore Project Development and Logistics Conference, which takes place on the 27th to 28th June 2011 in Perth. What other key aspects will you be touching on in your presentation?
I think the key messages from me next week will be quite simple, that Australia really has led the world in project finance. If you look around Australia, you look at the Victorian desal plants, you look at our Sydney toll roads, all those sort of things, and we have been at the forefront of developing really clever financing solutions for infrastructure. However, our industry now faces a major challenge to procure and fund resources infrastructure to sustain the growth of the mining industry. There is actually substantial capital available for the right projects, but to actually obtain that capital, you need to ensure three things. Firstly, you need to have careful planning at very early stages. Secondly, you really do need to understand the interaction between key project decisions and funding. And thirdly, you need to be willing to accept that all funding sources have individual benefits, but also hooks and constraints, and have an understanding that the funding decision really requires a trade-off and choosing that funding package that is right for your project.
Kate Vidgen, many thanks for your time today.
No problem. Thanks, James.